I'd been saving for 2 years to give my daughter a new car for her 20th birthday. She wasn't happy about it and didn't accept the gift. She wants an expensive convertible. It wasn't easy, between bills, home repairs and just the regular costs of living. I'd been putting money aside for her for 2 years, but it was tough. It wasn't something I could take lightly, but she was my daughter and she was turning 20, a milestone I felt deserved something special. For years she talked about wanting a car of her own. Whenever we saw one on the street she'd point out the flashy convertibles or sporty SUVs her friends were posting about online. I knew I couldn't afford anything too fancy, but I wanted to get her something practical and reliable. I chose a Hyundai, which was the car I thought would suit her best. It was new with good safety ratings, a comfortable interior and a decent warranty. It was something I could do without breaking the bank. I figured she'd understand that this wasn't just about giving. I wanted to give her a car. It was about giving her a step towards independence. On the morning of her birthday, I drove to the dealership and picked it up. I had them tie a big red bow on the hood, just like you see in those car commercials. I imagined her face lighting up when she saw it. I knew she'd be grateful, knowing how much effort I'd put in. I put a lot of effort into making this happen. As I drove home, I felt proud of myself. This was as big a deal for me as it was for her. It was a moment to show her how much I cared. I didn't realize that bow wouldn't be enough to fix what was to come. I parked the car in front of our house and took a moment to straighten the bow and made sure everything looked just right. My hands were a little shaky, partly from excitement and partly from nerves. I wanted this to be perfect when I walked into the house. She was already in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone. I called her over and told her I had a surprise waiting for her. Her eyes lit up as she put the phone down, and I felt a spark of hope that this would be the moment I had imagined. As we stepped outside, I gestured toward the car and smiled as I said, "Happy birthday, sweetheart." She froze, her eyes fixed on the Hyundai. For a moment, I thought it was because she seemed overwhelmed at first, but then her expression changed. I thought about how my friends would react. The words hit me like a punch. I tried to explain. I told her how hard I'd worked to save for it. I told her how reliable it was. I told her it was a good car for her to start with. But she wasn't listening. Her voice grew louder. She was more agitated. She began to cry. "This isn't fair. You're ruining my birthday." Her tears turned to full-blown frustration as she crossed her arms and glared at me. It was as if she thought I had done something unforgivable. "Do you even care about me?" she said, her voice breaking. I'd imagined a smile, maybe a hug, maybe even a thank you. Instead, it felt like every ounce of effort I'd put into this gift was being ripped apart. I said, my voice firm but calm, "The bus isn't it," she said, shaking her head and tears streaming down her face. "I can't believe you didn't think about what I wanted. You just picked what was easiest for you. That's dumb." He was starting to wonder if this was the right choice. He'd spent so much time thinking about what she wanted, only to have her dismiss it all so quickly. It felt like a punch in the gut. Her crying escalated and she began pacing. "I did my best, sweetheart," I said softly. "I'm sorry it's not what you wanted, but it's yours. It's better than nothing." She turned away, wiping away her tears angrily. I felt like arguing any more was pointless. I had worked long and hard to save for this car, but it seemed like it was all for nothing. I didn't say anything else. Instead, I walked to the car and took off the sheet. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and staring ahead. I was disappointed in myself for thinking this would be a moment we would both cherish. When I looked back, she was gone, back in the house, probably back on the phone or venting to her friends about how unfair her life was. I drove away, not sure where I was going, but knowing I couldn't stay there. The streets blurred together as I replayed the scene in my mind. I thought about how she used to be as a little girl, so full of excitement for the simplest of gifts. What had changed? Was it me? Was it her? After a while, I realized I had to take the car back if she didn't want it. There was no point in keeping it. I turned around and drove to the dealership, feeling more defeated with every mile. The dealership was quiet as I pulled in. The sun was already setting. The car, with its sleek design and immaculate, I parked near the entrance, sat for a few moments and took a deep breath. Returning the car wasn't just about getting my money back, it felt like admitting defeat, but there was no point in holding on to something she didn't want. Inside, I explained. I told the salesperson, who had helped me just a few days before, what had happened. They nodded sympathetically but didn't say much, which I appreciated. The process of returning the car was longer than I expected, filled with paperwork, and there were a few minor issues along the way. At one point, I had to step outside to clear my head. The crisp evening air was a welcome change of pace, but it didn't take away the heaviness I was feeling. When everything was done, I got back in my own car and sat in the parking lot for a while. I thought about the sacrifices I had made to save for this car, the little luxuries I'd given up and the long hours I'd worked, all for her. But now it was done, the car was gone and the money refunded, and I was left with nothing but a hollow pain in my chest. So I ended up returning the car that night. The people at the dealership were polite, but obviously uncomfortable. I could tell they were wondering what kind of ungrateful person would turn down a brand new car, but they didn't say it out loud. The drive home after that was pretty disheartening. I'd spent 2 years saving for something, and now I'd wasted it. I thought it would make her happy, but it ended up backfiring. I started to question everything. Had I done something wrong? Did I not listen to her enough? Or was she just like that now? When I got home, I didn't even want to go in the house. I just sat in my car for a while trying to figure out how things had gotten so out of control. By this point, I finally went inside, got something to eat and went to bed. I didn't even want to look at her or deal with whatever mood she was in. The next morning, she came to me as if nothing had happened. She didn't apologize or even acknowledge how she had acted. Instead, she complained about how exhausting the day had been. She said she hadn't eaten all day because of the stress. That's when I realized she didn't care about me, the effort I'd put in, or the fact that she'd essentially thrown away a huge gift. She just expected me to pick up the pieces and move on, like it was my job to make sure she was okay. Life stayed perfect. I hugged her because, honestly, what else could I do? Inside, though, I felt completely drained. It wasn't just the car. It was the realization that no matter how much I gave, it would never be enough for her. After that morning, something shifted inside of me. Hugging her and hearing her casually complain. It made me realize that this wasn't just one bad day. It was a pattern. For years I had tried to give her the best I could. I had worked overtime, cut back on my own needs, and said yes to more things than I should have. And now at 20, she saw all of that. As if that wasn't enough, the car situation was just the most obvious example. She went about her day as usual, texting her friends and talking about plans for the weekend. I went to work, but my mind wasn't on my job. I kept replaying the events in my head, wondering how I'd gotten to this point. When I got home, she was getting ready to go out again. She mentioned something about her friends in a club, barely looking up from her phone. She didn't thank me, apologize, or even acknowledge what I'd done for her birthday. I just nodded, watched her leave, and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Coffee. That night, I realized I was more than just frustrated. I was hurt. I sat alone in the quiet house, staring at my coffee cup and feeling a mixture of exhaustion and sadness. It wasn't just the car or her reaction. It was everything. All the little moments over the years. When I'd go to great lengths to make her happy, only to find that she saw it as her right, I started to think back to when she was younger. I remembered saving up to buy her a new bike when she was 12, and how her face had lit up when she saw it. She'd hugged me so tightly that day, and I felt like the best dad in the world. But somewhere along the way things changed. Maybe it was my fault for trying to protect her from every struggle. I'd said yes too often and not set boundaries. Or maybe it was just who she'd become, someone who took things for granted and expected the world to revolve around her. The realization hit me hard. I'd worked myself to the bone for years, not just for her birthday, but for so many moments like this. And yet here I was sitting alone, feeling like I'd failed as a father. I thought about the car, now back at the dealership, and the hours of overtime I'd put in to make it happen. I thought about her. She said it in such a way that made me feel embarrassed and like her friends would laugh at me. It wasn't just ungrateful, it was cruel. I wanted to believe that she could change, maybe not now but someday. I didn't do much that night. I sat there for hours replaying everything in my head. When she came home late from the club, I heard her laughing with her friends as they left the house. She didn't even stop to see if I was awake. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. She was still asleep. Probably she was still out with her friends, so the house was quiet. It felt heavier than ever, though. I couldn't shake the thought that I was losing her, not physically but emotionally. I spent the morning cleaning up, more out of habit than necessity. As I passed her room, I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should knock and try to talk to her. But I remembered how she reacted to the car, so I decided there was no point. What was the point? She'd made it clear how she felt. It was late afternoon when she finally came out. She walked into the kitchen with her phone out and was scrolling as she poured herself a glass of water. She barely acknowledged me, just grunting out a half-hearted good morning when it was anything but. Then, without missing a beat, she said, "I'm starving. Yesterday was so stressful." I stared at her, trying to process what I just heard. Stressful for her, after everything that had happened, she still saw herself as a victim. I didn't say anything, just nodded and went back to my work. Inside though, I felt like I reached my breaking point. It wasn't just the car or her words. It was the complete lack of understanding or appreciation for anything I had done. The rest of the day went by in a blur. She went back to her routine, texting and chatting with her friends as if nothing had happened. I kept to myself, feeling more and more disconnected from the person I thought I knew. By the evening, I realized I couldn't keep this bottled up any longer. Watching her go about her day as if nothing had happened, completely unaware. The weight of her actions made me feel like a stranger in my own home. She was sitting in the living room laughing at something on her cell phone. I stood in the doorway for a moment, trying to decide if it was worth saying anything. Part of me wanted to let it go to avoid another argument, but the other part of me, the exhausted, drained part, knew I had to say something. I didn't want to start a fight, so I kept my words simple. I told her how much I'd sacrificed to get her that car and how long I'd worked and saved to get her something I thought she'd like. I told her how her reaction had hurt me, not because I wanted her to feel guilty, but because I needed her to understand the impact of her words. For a moment she looked up from her phone, her expression unreadable. Instead of reacting, she just shrugged and said, "I told you I didn't want to." That was it. No apology. No acknowledgement of what I'd said. Just a shrug. I felt my chest tighten. A mixture of anger and heartbreak bubbled up to the I didn't raise my voice or argue. I just walked out of the room and sat in my car for what seemed like hours, wondering what I had done wrong. After days of silence and reflection, I found myself doing something I swore I wouldn't do. Despite everything, her reaction, her entitlement, her lack of gratitude, I couldn't shake the desire to make her happy. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was love, or maybe it was just the irrational hope that things would be different this time. This time I went to the bank and took it wasn't a small one, either. It would have been enough to buy her the car she'd explicitly said she wanted, a shiny new Mercedes convertible. The monthly payments would stretch my budget to the limit, but I told myself it was worth it. Once the paperwork was done and the car was in my possession, I spent another evening planning the unveiling. I wanted to recreate the excitement of her birthday and give her a second chance to appreciate what I was doing for her. The next day, I called her and told her I surprised her and asked her to meet me in the car park of a local park. She sounded curious but not overly excited, probably assuming it was something small. When she arrived, I stood next to the car, trying to hide my nervousness. Her eyes widened as soon as she saw it. She clapped her hands over her mouth and her phone slipped from her fingers as she ran toward me. "Oh my God," she asked, practically bouncing on her feet. I nodded, unable to stop a small smile from creeping across my face. "Happy late birthday," I said. She squealed and threw her arms around me in a rare moment of affection. It would be tough to pay back the loan. I knew this pattern could repeat itself, but for now she was happy. That happiness brought me a brief sense of peace, even if it came at my own expense. A few months passed, and life returned to some semblance of normal. The loan payments were as stressful as I'd expected, but seeing her joy every time she drove her new car made it somewhat bearable. She often posted photos with her Mercedes, tagging her friends and sharing her dream come true. While I thought I'd done enough this time, one night at the dinner table she mentioned something that made my stomach drop. "You know, Dad," she began twirling her fork around her plate. I've been thinking the Mercedes is nice, but I think I'm ready for something new. A Porsche would be great, it's more my vibe now. I put down my fork and stared at her, waiting for her to laugh or say she was joking, but she wasn't. She was serious. I just outgrew the Mercedes. She carried on, saying that it was fine but that she wanted something that really stood out, something different. I thought about how far I'd go to make her happy. Later that night, I sat alone and thought about how much I'd done for her over the years, the bike, the trips, the countless sacrifices. The Mercedes felt like I'd given her everything I could, and it still wasn't enough. I laughed to myself and shook my head. Maybe her future husband will take care of the Porsche. I thought, I've done my part as her father. The next chapter is someone else's turn. It was meant as a joke, but deep down I hoped it was true.